29 years after the handover, 6 years after the imposition of the national security law, and after more than 10,000 pro democracy citizens have been arrested, the question isn't what's happened in Hong Kong. The question is, what does Hong Kong tell us about China? Today we're joined by Megan Khoo. She's the policy director at Hong Kong Watch. And we're going to have a conversation about Hong Kong, but also about China and about the geopolitical risks that most business leaders and politicians still don't fully understand. I'm Dominic Bowen and I'm host of the International Risk podcast, where we unpack the topics that really matter. Now, this isn't a story about just one city or even about broken promises made under the Chinese-UK joint declaration. Hong Kong represents something much larger. It's about whether authoritarian states can use law, whether they can use finance, trade, migration, overseas officers, and even the diaspora to intimidate and sometimes even reshape the international order without a single shot being fired. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Megan, welcome to the International Risk podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. I'm glad to be here with you.
Megan, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about Hong Kong Watch? Who is it? What do you guys do?
Yes, so Hong Kong Watch is a human rights advocacy organization specifically for Hong Kong. We also have a lot of research that we do, so a bit of a think tank angle. Hong Kong Watch was founded in 2017 in response to everything that was going on in Hong Kong. So essentially, my colleagues that co-founded the organization, and they're still involved both here in London and also in Canada, they founded Hong Kong Watch, seeing it as a gap that quite literally needed to be monitored by the international community. So Hong Kong Watch came into an existence, and it was especially pivotal during the 2019 protests that were happening in Hong Kong through 2020. We led the widest international response with over 900 parliamentarians condemning what was happening in Hong Kong at the time. And since then, Hong Kong Watch has kept a close eye on what's happening in Hong Kong. And we have many networks in the UK, EU, Canada, and the US among the Hong Kong diaspora, and also keep in contact, of course, very close with what's happening in Hong Kong. So we just keep an eye on this and work with international governments to get to the bottom of what's going on and to call for accountability.
And Megan, in 2022, before Russia actually invaded the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was speaking with a lot of boards and a lot of executive teams and really encouraging them to have a conversation about their Russian operations. It was amazing. As a matter of fact, there was very few large European companies that didn't have a presence in Russia. And their operations were often very, very profitable. And I was encouraging them, like, you need to have a conversation about whether you can continue your operations in Russia. No one was willing to have that conversation until the invasion. And then they were forced to have it. In Hong Kong, it's a little bit different because there was some promises made. And I think many executives have just avoided discussing really what's happening in Hong Kong for the same reason that they didn't want to consider that Russia might invade Ukraine. Now, Hong Kong's not a democracy in any meaningful sense. Civil rights, political freedoms are definitely narrower than what they were before 2019. Now, the city still has rule of law features, it still has open markets, but politics, protests, the media, speech, these environments are now much more controlled. So, Megan, I wonder if you can tell us, are Western companies still operating in Hong Kong because it is genuinely safe, it is genuinely open for business, or are they doing it because admitting that risk would just be something that's uncomfortable and ultimately too expensive for them?
Yes. So unfortunately, many international companies are still operating in Hong Kong. And it's actually one of the things that the Hong Kong government and Chinese authorities are pointing to show or allude to things being normal in Hong Kong. However, work done by Hong Kong Watch and also many other Hong Kong research and advocacy organizations are finding that there's a severe risk posed to businesses that continue to operate in Hong Kong. And we're also finding that some companies are evading Western sanctions through Hong Kong, which is also something historically that had happened with Russia as well. So again, what you're saying, when Russia invaded Ukraine and they were forced to ask the question, that's yet to be the case in Hong Kong. But I think within the next 5 and definitely 10 years, companies will need to scrutinize their investments in Hong Kong. And again, I think the international community should look at a bit closer at what's going on with their investments and securities that are passing through, especially the ones that are invading Western sanctions. And this is something that we are continuing to do work on, and we'll have a report out later this year on.
Great. So for our business leaders, that has companies, that has staff, that has data, that has legal exposure, maybe banking relationships, maybe regional headquarters in Hong Kong. Is it is it over? Is it hyperbolic to say that Beijing has leverage over that company, whether Beijing has influence? How would you describe what that looks like?
Yeah, it's not hyperbolic to say that Beijing would have influence over an international company based in Hong Kong. And the clearest evidence of this is the national security law in Hong Kong itself, which was passed in 2020. And under the national security law, it has completely eroded civil society and the freedoms in Hong Kong as the world knew them. But specifically for businesses, there's been new laws, even recently, under the national security law that would require anyone, foreigner, Hong Konger, even transiting through Hong Kong, if they were asked by the Hong Kong National Security Police to hand over their phone or any devices and didn't provide the data, they could be subject to arrest and prosecution. So this is something that developed in the last year, but we would expect that the surveillance and access to data and privacy that we see on mainland China is, if not already, very near to happening in Hong Kong as well. So again, this is an area that we're monitoring quite closely, as well as a lot of international institutions, just to give companies warnings with what could be happening to their assets and investments in Hong Kong.
Now, most companies, and certainly most European companies, and I work with a very large number of the largest companies in Europe, whenever their staff travel to Hong Kong, we have conversations. We give them pre deployment briefs about what to be aware of, the security risks, the impact to information security, the implications for intellectual property. Companies that want to be selling products in China often have to share some of their IP with state actors, and then they invariably find that they're leaked to Chinese based companies and lose a competitive advantage. But there's some legal advisors that I meet with that still tell me that no, 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 Hong Kong is different. Hong Kong is a separate and distinct entity in a distinct geographic space. We don't need to have the same security controls around our intellectual property, around our information security, around our staff traveling there. Is Hong Kong still a separate jurisdiction from mainland China, or is that a dangerous or maybe a fictitious distinction?
So recently, on July 1st, we marked the 29th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong to China. And here at Hong Kong Watch, we work very closely with Lord Patton, who was the former governor of Hong Kong and the last governor of Hong Kong. And when the handover happened, the one country, two systems framework was promised through the Sino British Joint Declaration, which now, 20 years on, effectively is dead in practice. So that's what I would tell those legal practitioners. In this declaration, a high degree of autonomy, an independent judiciary, and protected rights and freedoms were enshrined until 2047. However, in recent years, especially since the protests that we saw in mass in 2019, the rule of law and fundamental freedoms that were guaranteed in that declaration and in the basic law of Hong Kong have been systematically dismantled, especially since the national security law. So today, one country, two systems on paper, and I would say some people, like you're referring to in practice, would say that it's in existence. But Beijing has completely eradicated this and done every effort they can to, and they only continue to do this. In addition to the national security law, mainland China just passed on July 1st the Ethnic Unity and Progress Law, which in name might sound harmless to any international observer, but in practice, it targets 56 ethnic minority groups across China, and this includes Hong Kong. And so the targeted erosion of freedoms that we've seen happen in Hong Kong now is going to continue threatening Hong Kong, but also Tibet in the Xinjiang region and also other minority groups around China. So again, while on paper things may seem fine, China on the mainland and also via Hong Kong are really cracking down more than now than ever.
And so, what is your message to business leaders? I mean, you're an advocacy organisation, a human rights organisation. You produce policy briefs and background research papers. So you should be speaking out, and you are. And you know, your the products and the information you release is a really good quality. But CEOs, they've got a responsibility to their shareholders and their various stakeholders who may not be people from Hong Kong. And I think sometimes we see is that Western companies will usually self-censor much faster than the Chinese Communist Party will or could regulate them or censure them. What are the expectations? What would you be if you were sitting down and having lunch with some CEOs for some large European or North American companies? what would you be asking them to do? What would you be expecting them to do? Those people that are listening to this podcast now, what's your message to them?
Yeah, to any international business leaders or companies, I would definitely advise them to be aware of the risk of continuing to do business in Hong Kong. So currently, Hong Kong does not have a great firewall, for example, like China, but it is definitely moving in that direction. And also, with new laws that are in place under the national security law, as I previously referenced, any employee, foreigner or not, that is inside of Hong Kong could be legally required to give over their data or access to their device, their cell phone, their laptop, work or personal, to the Hong Kong police. And anything that they have on there, especially if it did have things that we would normally consider completely legal and within our rights under the freedom of expression, that could be criminalized. And the fact that that can be criminalized to a foreigner, not just someone in Hong Kong, although that's also unjust, is something that businesses need to be aware of. They need to be informing their employees of this. And I would highly recommend that they have some sort of reporting system in place internally within their company so that if employees, especially foreign employees, are facing struggles like this, that they can safely, anonymously report it back to their company so that the company can do a very comprehensive risk analysis of the pros and cons of remaining in Hong Kong. But in time, Hong Kong, it's already not a safe place to do business. And in time, it will be equated to doing business in mainland China, which many businesses are aware of the risks of that, especially when it comes to data and privacy.
And you mentioned some of these things before, but I think Hong Kong really is a painful test case. I mean, Beijing broke promises, crushed opposition, it's intimidated critics abroad, but it's still kept global finance. It's still kept it open to Western markets. It's very profitable for Beijing. I'm wondering if Beijing learnt an important lesson that the West has a very low appetite when it comes to confrontation, but a very high appetite when it comes to potential profitability. And it then makes me think about the next step about, is this a potential approach that Beijing may use in Taiwan and the South China Sea?
Yeah, I definitely think that Hong Kong is going to be the playbook for what China and how they're viewing Taiwan right now and how it will approach Taiwan in the future. So in Hong Kong currently, not only do we have the imposition of the national security law, which came on in 2020, but we also had the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, which furthered the restrictions in the national security law imposed in 2024. And this year in Hong Kong, we're seeing the entrenchment of patriotic education. So instilling in children that they must love the motherland, which is mainland China, that they must bow down to the Chinese Communist Party. What are normal practices on the mainland are now being not only exported but forced in Hong Kong. There's also now very vague offenses for speech, and this is also covered under the new China ethnic unity law, so to speak. But all of these things, in especially the extraterritorial reach. So not only is the national security law contained within Hong Kong, if you live in Britain and you're from Hong Kong and you're critiquing the Hong Kong government, some individuals, they put bounties out for their arrests. So it could be that case if it's high profile, but other people are being intimidated and threatened. And we actually ran a survey earlier this year among the Hong Kong diaspora in the UK. And 66% of Hong Kongers said that they felt like they were at risk of transnational repression. And that's here in the UK. So these laws are within Hong Kong. They have an extraterritorial reach. And we definitely expect that this is what's going to happen among China's ethnic minorities, its border regions, and especially Taiwan. And I think if China's seeing how unfortunately weak the international community is in response to some of the things that are happening in Taiwan, not least the arrest and almost now life sentencing of a British citizen, Jimmy Lai. He was sentenced earlier this year to 20 years in prison. If they're getting away with these things by the UK government and even the US government, what's not to say that they'll get away with their plans that they have for Taiwan in whatever form that eventually takes? So I think Hong Kong is the playbook, and it definitely should serve as a warning for Taiwan, but also as a roadmap for the international community on how they engage with Hong Kong will also have severe implications in Taiwan as well.
And as we discussed, and as you just mentioned, Hong Kong is still a major financial, it's a major legal hub, but the balance of evidence clearly suggests that Hong Kong also functions as a conduit for sanctions evasions, for capital routing, political leverage, and strategic access into many Western systems. Now, we know that Hong Kong used to be really valued as this trusted bridge into China because of its separate legal system, because of, that convertibility between the West and Hong Kong and then into China. It had this open financial infrastructure. but more and more we're seeing evidence and investigations that Beijing is really hollowing out that autonomy while still keeping the commercial benefits of separation. And I think that shift really matters because whilst it provides access to dollar clearing and banking and capital markets and international trade and finance, which is really important, it's the sanctions and export control circumvention that really concerns me. And, this is something that I speak to a lot of my clients about that they need to be aware of because of that, what I see as sanctions evasion. And we're seeing flows into Russia, into Iran, into North Korea. That's something that law abiding, good businesses, European, North American businesses with links to Hong Kong need to be aware of. Talk to us about that. Is that something that business leaders and politicians need to be paying more attention to?
Yes, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more spotlight and research done on sanctions evasion that's happening via Hong Kong. And that's something here at Hong Kong Watch that we're looking specifically into. So I think that companies need to be aware that this is happening because it could put them directly at risk of violating Western sanctions, whether it's the main company, subsidiary companies. Hong Kong's being used as a front where mainland China can say, don't worry, we're still exactly as you're saying, financially sound, everything business as usual, but that's not the case. And when these things are happening, especially behind closed doors, it will later come back to hurt businesses and their profits, especially then if they have been evading sanctions, whether they're aware of it or not. There will be consequences, especially if it's coming, for example, from the US side. So I think that international businesses really need to be hyper aware that Hong Kong is being used as a front by China. And it will only continue to be, especially as China looks towards Taiwan in the coming years.
And I wonder, is this more a story of Chinese authoritarianism, or is it more a story about Western dependencies? Because I think most people, most of our listeners, most people that are listening to this conversation today would say that they care about democracy and they care about democracy in Hong Kong. But many of the listeners that are listening to this conversation today, Megan, probably also want Chinese money. They want Chinese supply chains. They want the Chinese students. They want the access to the Chinese markets or Chinese manufacturing. And so I can't help but wonder, is this more about Chinese authoritarianism or about Western dependency on access to these markets?
Yeah, I would say it's both and depending on what side you look at it. So, but on the Chinese side, it's definitely the Chinese government's desire for control. The Chinese Communist Party is clamping down on Hong Kong, and it is not what the world sees. Like I mentioned earlier, you have a British citizen who is in jail for simply running a pro democracy newspaper. It was the largest at the time in Hong Kong, but still, things that would be completely legal in the West are banned and clamped down in Hong Kong. Also, in the last year, there was the sentencing of a father of a US based activist known as Anna Kwok. He was given 8 months in jail for just trying to cancel his daughter's insurance policy after she has not lived in Hong Kong for years. The laws that are now in Hong Kong reach into ordinary family life for those that live there, and they punish association even with those overseas now. So Hong Kong is not what it seems on the outside. Just in the last month, there's been multiple arrests of commentators, journalists, and another independent bookshop, actually two, have been shut down. There's the crackdowns widening from very high profile activists that are in Hong Kong and now outside of Hong Kong, but also to ordinary civil society and small Hong Kong businesses. So this is happening on one front, while on the same front, there, like you said, there is still a large business presence. However, I do think that businesses, as you're alluding to, are motivated by the financial capital. Well, we're here. Maybe all this is happening in the background. Some people are screaming about it and bringing attention to it, but we can kind of keep our heads down and keep doing what we're doing, which for now might be working. And Hong Kong is being used as a front by China to say, oh, look, it's all still as normal as it was 5 years ago, as far as an international business person would be concerned. But what's happening on the streets will eventually, let's say, pour over into the business community as well. And like I said, Hong Kong will look a lot more like doing business not in Hong Kong, but in mainland China, which poses huge risks to Westerners as far as their data and their privacy, and also even the fact that businesses currently have to brief people before they're going to Hong Kong or having to use burner phones. I see this very frequently when they're there. Not only points to it being similar to mainland China, but points to that freedoms and life as we know it, let's say in the West, and democracy and exercising our fundamental rights that are guaranteed under international law are being broken in Hong Kong. And that does have an impact on how businesses do business. And right now, while it might work, Hong Kong is only moving in the wrong direction as far as these things. So I think it's both Beijing wanting further control neutral, wanting to clamp down on Hong Kong and its other regions and territories, similar to what it is looking to do in Taiwan. And at the same time, businesses are invested in Hong Kong, and currently pulling away from Hong Kong might lose financial capital. But at the same time, we have already also seen companies that are moving away from Hong Kong. There's been a mass exodus of companies going to Singapore. So I think people are slowly starting to be aware of this. And I would only think that this increases as time passes in the next 5 years.
And you mentioned some of the people that have been caught up in some of the rest and some of the pro democracy. My understanding is that the pro democracy movement has been severely weakened and largely suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party, but it's not entirely gone. But the most visible activists are either imprisoned, they're facing new national security cases, or they've self-exiled. And the government, the Chinese government and the de facto government in Hong Kong, is still tightening the legal framework around the branding of national security. I mean, there was massive power on the street and public displays of pro-democracy back in the 2020s. But, after, as I said, over 10,000 people being arrested, activists arrested, some of them trying to flee the country, some of them arrested in boats whilst trying to flee the country. Can you tell us about the status of the movement today?
Yeah, so like you said, the pro democracy movement in Hong Kong was a mass force in 2019 and 2020. And I would say that that still exists. Unfortunately, I think that the morale within the wider movement, which is now largely in exile around the world, is a bit low given it has been 10 years. But there definitely still is a movement. Within Hong Kong, unfortunately, I think that people still subtly try to express their desire for democracy or wanting to do what they previously could have done. For example, Hong Kong used to have the largest commemorations of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which happened in Beijing. This happened at Victoria Park in Hong Kong in the past. And now this year, for example, on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, there were 7 people between the ages of 17 and 79 that were taken away around Victoria Park. And these were for very minor actions, such as carrying a paper flower in their hand, for bowing in prayer. Someone who was singing was removed from the streets. People were stopped and searched for holding a 6.4-meter red string because it alluded to 6/4 being June 4th. So in Hong Kong, people still have very subtle expressions, but it's severely clamped down, virtually non existent. Now the movement largely lives outside of Hong Kong, and we especially have a large movement here in the UK. There's over 200,000 Hong Kongers that have exiled here, and there's also a very large presence in Canada, but also around the world in the US, Australia, and throughout the EU. So the democracy movement now, what I'm seeing personally, as I myself am not a Hong Konger, in the EU, because there's far fewer Hong Kongers that are currently in the EU, they formed an alliance together for their movement to go before politicians as an alliance. And those Hong Kongers now in the UK are also looking to do the same thing, to form an alliance, to be one voice. 10 years on, where is Hong Kong? They're considering what it looks like. What do they want to push for? At this point, it's a lot of international accountability, calling for the release of political prisoners like Jimmy Lai, but also others like Chow Hung Tung, Lee Chuk Yan. So they're really reconsidering what they want to press international governments on. They're forming alliances to be one voice, to hopefully have more impact, to hopefully get those policy things pushed and changed. So I think the movement is very much still alive. It's largely in exile. In Hong Kong, it's subtle. Outside of Hong Kong, I think it still does have a voice, although morale might shift here and there. But it definitely is still alive. It's alive in organizations like ours. Hong Kong Watch is one of the largest Hong Kong advocacy organizations in the world, but it also really exists in all of the diaspora community groups and organizations we see all over the world. That is the heartbeat of the movement, the Hong Kongers themselves. Some of them now have moved into like what we would say are normal jobs outside of the advocacy space, specifically for Hong Kong, but many of them have their heart in the movement. They're very happy to share their stories, especially before politicians, and especially where transnational repression is concerned. So for high profile activists who have fled from Hong Kong, they're very keen to share their story and to ultimately push for accountability on the Chinese Communist Party.
And I think that's a really important learning point. You talked about burner phones earlier on, and some of our listeners might not be familiar with that. But generally, when traveling to a country where there's high levels of surveillance, we encourage people to travel with burner phones and burner laptops. So basically, laptops and phones that have no personal details on them, no access to your bank accounts, your emails, definitely no information from your company or link back to your servers. And that's common practice now. Most businesses do that now when traveling to many countries. But it's an extra level of surveillance when you think about the amount of surveillance that must be occurring in Hong Kong, that just in Causeway Bay, when, as you said, on the 3rd of June, the street performer was just unveiling a 6.4 meter red string. That's all he was doing. He was a street performer unveiling a 6.4 meter string. And before he'd even fully unveiled it, the police had stopped him, searched him, and stopped the performance. And that occurs all over the country. I mean, that level of surveillance is, if you can take away the human rights and the moral aspect of it, it's impressive. It's very, very impressive. I
Mm.
mean, the state's penetration into all aspects of society is really huge.
Yeah, exactly. And they now also have a push to have thousands more of CCTV cameras around Hong Kong, similar to mainland China. And also, they've just, again, last month introduced new subsidiary legislation to the national security law in Hong Kong that lets the chief executive of Hong Kong, which is currently John Lee, certify any case as a national security matter. So it's binding on courts and it cannot be challenged. So this could be I want to say, a lesser crime, an ordinary crime that could happen on the society level, and now all of a sudden the chief executive has the power to determine that it's national security and have those consequences attached to it. So it's completely shredding any remains of the independence of the judiciary in Hong Kong, and it also punishes far more people under this guise.
But I remember being a really young kid, just old enough to understand different countries, but not really old enough to understand the detail. But I know my mum, she was desperate to go to Hong Kong before Britain handed it over to China. And I remember listening to mum, and I remember the news, and I remember, obviously this was a big news story in the couple of years leading up to it. And there were politicians, there were diplomats, universities, corporations, everyone arguing that this was a positive move, that engagement with China would make China more open, it would make China's actions more predictable, it would make China more respectful of international rules. It was around that time, or a little bit after, that China was invited to join the World Trade Organization. All this was seen as a positive evolution. When we look at Hong Kong today, it would potentially suggest that the opposite happened.
Mm.
Who got this wrong, and how did everyone get it so wrong? And perhaps even more importantly, who is paying the price today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think with Hong Kong, and as especially as we just marked the 29th anniversary of the handover, it was a miscalculation at the time, but I don't think that anyone could have predicted that prior to 2047, which again was the time under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, that in practice one country two systems was supposed to be in play. I don't think anyone could have anticipated that Hong Kong would go like this far sooner. So I think it was a gross miscalculation, most particularly by the UK government. However, I would say that the UK government did, in direct response to the introduction of the national security law. So, after we saw the mass protests in 2019 and 2020, the UK government did respond by introducing the British National Overseas Visa Scheme for Hong Kongers, which has allowed over 200,000 Hong Kongers to flee from Hong Kong. So while it was a gross miscalculation, largely on the UK government at the time, they have now taken a lot of Hong Kongers in. But of course, those that are paying the price the most are the Hong Kongers that are in Hong Kong, that still remain in Hong Kong, especially those that are behind bars in Hong Kong for doing things that you and I would do every day. And behind that, it's the Hong Kongers that live all over the world in the greater diaspora. And I know that they carry the stories that they have from Hong Kong, their lived experiences, and honestly, even their families. Some of them still have families back in Hong Kong. And I know it's incredibly painful for them to know what has happened there and what continues to happen. So, yeah, the Hong Kongers are definitely paying the greatest price for it.
This wasn't part of the planned conversation, Megan, but you did bring up the UK's miscalculation, and it would feel remiss of me not to ask you about something to do with miscalculation and security and espionage and privacy and politics, and that's China's mega embassy near the
Mm.
Royal Mint Court in London. Now, there's been so much media about it, which makes me think it would be remiss of me not to ask you about that, because so many people have talked about, this side of this new mega embassy is right beside London's fiber optic infrastructure. And that presents very significant surveillance risks, impacts on nearby residents, of course, Hong Kong activists. And it's difficult to argue that this is just a normal diplomatic project. MPs have raised security concerns, residents have raised privacy concerns. Certainly, there's been a lot of Hong Kong diaspora raising concerns around the politics and the human rights of it. And then, of course, there's been significant transparency issues when some of the planning and some of the drawings have been leaked that show that there is, very significant concerns about security and the proximity of the embassy. Is that something that you've looked at or able to comment on today?
Yes, absolutely. Hong Kong Watch has been present at repeated protests that have happened at the proposed site for the new Chinese mega embassy in London. And at all of these protests, as you said, there has been a great number of Hong Kongers opposing what's happening. And the local residents are in the process of opposing it now. And essentially, we're in a waiting period to see what happens. So, as far as it rests with the courts today, I do not want to comment on that. But on the mega embassy in general, it should not go ahead in any way, shape, or form. And the UK government should have long shut this down. Especially, I know you've recently followed that we had the first convictions and then last month sentences under the UK's National Security Act of Peter Y and Bill UN. And they were sentenced to 10 and 8 years in prison for assisting Hong Kong intelligence operations. And they ran their operations out of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office in London. So, if these two individuals were essentially engaging in espionage related activities outside of a Hong Kong related office in London, if there were to be a Chinese mega embassy in London, I would not even want to know the vast risks that poses. Like you said, even just through infrastructure, there's very high surveillance risks, and in that area specifically. But if it's happening in a small Hong Kong trade office, proposing a mass embassy where all of a sudden there would be the relocation, because of course there's already a Chinese embassy in London, but an expanded one with more employees, more, I would say, bodies then to engage in surveillance activities to monitor pro democracy activists that live outside of Hong Kong or that have relocated even from China. It's a major national security threat to the UK. And this has also just been an issue in the background for many years now. So the Conservative government, now the Labour government, it must be addressed. And especially as we have incoming expected Prime Minister Andy Burnham step in, this is something that should be reviewed very closely and should definitely be shut down. Honestly, with all of the information that's out there now, with all of the research that has been done, whether it's related to the Hong Kong diaspora in the UK or otherwise, there should be no way that the embassy continues to go ahead. So I would hope that the incoming government in the UK, which is very imminent, that they would review this as one of the first things.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. And what you're referring to actually was a conversation we had back at episode 368 with Sam Goodman. He's the Senior Policy Director at the China Strategic Risks Institute. And we were talking about this transnational repression, the shadow policing, where shadow Chinese police stations are set up all around the world, and the geopolitical reach of China. And as I said, those two arrests that occurred in the UK. So thanks very much for mentioning that, Megan. And one question that we ask all guests that come on the International Risk podcast, you're obviously from America, you've worked in Congress, you've worked in the US Department of Defense, you're now based in London and working with Hong Kong Watch. When you look around the world, you've got a great perspective. What are the international risks that concern you the most?
We've already touched on it today, but definitely Taiwan. And I would definitely look at that as one of the biggest international risks in the next few years. So, unfortunately, Hong Kong today, rights, freedoms have been completely eradicated. There's very little that's left. And the little that is left is just so that the Hong Kong government can say, oh, look, everything's normal here. But the mainland China will definitely use Hong Kong, as I previously said, as a roadmap for Taiwan. So I'd be very concerned what happens in Taiwan in the next few years. But again, I am encouraged that I think the international community is very aware of China's plans for Taiwan. It's very monitored in the news, what's happening, like routine monitoring in the Taiwan Strait. And actually, just this week, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China brought some of their allies, and two of them were British MPs, including Alicia Kearns and Tom Tugendhat. They actually went for the first time ever, that a foreign delegation of legislators, they went on the Taiwan Strait Coast Guard monitoring expedition, and they were able to join the Coast Guard in monitoring what was happening in the Taiwan Strait. So I'm encouraged that this is closely being watched by not only the Coast Guard locally, but also the international community and parliamentarians and politicians worldwide. But I think the international community needs to keep a very close eye on Taiwan, look at what's happening in Hong Kong, both freedom wise, but also at those in exile in regards to transnational repression, and definitely be prepared to, take action. I think that unfortunately, the international response to some of the things, especially human rights in Hong Kong, have been quite weak in many areas, and that should not be able to continue going forth. So I think, again, it serves as a roadmap, but I definitely think that we should learn from the responses that have happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, Megan. And we've had some great conversations over the last few years about Taiwan and some potential what escalation would look like. And I think many people expect that it would be, bombers flying over Taiwan in a very conventional war. But there's also a very, and perhaps even a higher risk that it's a much more shadowy takeover of obviously the creation of islands, which we're already seeing, but also things like the use of tariffs and trade and manipulation of foreign businesses that are already working in Taiwan. And of course, one of the most well-known companies that we all know, Taiwan Semiconductors.
Mhm.
If TSMC, could we just walk away, or would people feel influenced to accept new rules and obligations put on by the Chinese Communist Party, and that could put us in a really difficult spot where a US or European administrations would be forced to make decisions that would really be forcing to give up one hand in order to take advantage of the other. So yeah, really, really complex environment there, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And
Mhm.
I'm very glad you came on the podcast today, Megan. Thank you very much for your time and explaining all that for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for putting light on what's happening in Hong Kong, but also to Hong Kongers around the world.
Well, that was a great conversation with Megan Khoo. She's the policy director at Hong Kong Watch. And I really appreciated her insights as to what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in China, and the impacts on geopolitics and what European and North American business leaders really need to be considering. I'm Dominic Bowen. I'm host of the International Risk Podcast. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the International Risk Podcast. For more episodes and articles, visit theinternationalriskpodcast.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky and Instagram for the latest updates and to ask your questions to our host, Dominic Bowen. See you next time.